I found out on a Sunday in March. The light through the kitchen window was the particular flat white light of a Belgian winter that has decided to pretend it is spring, the light that promises warmth it does not have. And I was standing at the counter in my dressing gown making coffee in the Italian machine that Vivienne had insisted on buying 4 years ago and that I had learned to operate competently without ever developing any affection for it. I was thinking about a contract review I needed to complete before Tuesday. I was thinking about whether to drive or take the train to Antwerp for the meeting on Wednesday. I was thinking about nothing unusual, and then I turned around. I should tell you about the title of this account before I tell you the rest of it. The 70% refers to a number in a document. The document was a draft settlement agreement that Vivienne's lawyer presented during an early stage of the proceedings, a preliminary proposal that her lawyer described, with the practiced neutrality of a professional delivering a position that they know will be contested as a reasonable starting point for negotiation. The number at the core of the proposal was 70% of the marital estate to go to Vivienne. I read the number in that document sitting at Michelle's conference table, and I smiled. I smiled because I understood what it meant not as a legal position, but as a statement of what Vivienne and her lawyer believed my position to be, which was the position of a man who had been taken by surprise, who had not had time to prepare, and who could be settled with quickly if the initial proposal was pitched at a level that made him feel he was being treated generously even as he was being taken advantage of. The 70% was a read of my vulnerability, and the read was wrong. The final settlement was significantly different from 70%. The distance between the two numbers was the product of the week of appearing normal and the 40 minutes on the bed and the 23-page inventory and the Monday morning meeting with Michelle and the 4 legal actions and the coffee with Christophe and the professional information that nobody had anticipated would be in the picture. The distance was also the product of 34 years of building a practice on the understanding that the first number is never the final number and that the space between them belongs to whoever is better prepared to occupy it. I was better prepared. I found out on a Sunday in March. I have been asked since whether I felt it coming, whether there was a presentiment, an unease, some atmospheric pressure drop in the domestic weather that should have told me something was wrong. I have answered honestly each time no, there was nothing. The kitchen looked exactly as it always looked. The coffee was making its usual sound. The light was the light it was. And my wife Vivienne and my son-in-law Christophe were standing in the far corner of the kitchen in each other's arms in a way that answered every question about what had been happening before I had consciously formulated any of the questions. I stood there with the coffee in my hand for what I estimate was approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when it contains the collapse of 31 years. In those 4 seconds, I processed the following: the specific way his hand was positioned at the small of her back, which was not the hand position of a family embrace. The fact that neither of them had heard me because the machine had been loud and the kitchen acoustics were poor. The expression on Vivienne's face in the instant before she registered my presence, which was an expression I had not seen her direct at me in a considerable number of years, and the precise understanding that this was not the first time. That the confidence of the body language was the confidence of practice. Then she saw me. The sequence that followed was the conventional sequence of such discoveries. Colour leaving a face, a step backward, a hand lifted toward the throat, a name said with a question mark inside it. Georg. She said my name as if she was not entirely certain it was me or that I was real. Christophe turned, and his face did something more complicated than hers, working through shock and guilt and the specific additional dimension that belonged to a man who had betrayed not one person but 2 people he was supposed to love and had known this about himself and had continued anyway. I put the coffee cup on the counter. I put it down carefully on the exact spot I usually put it because I was finding that the maintenance of precise ordinary action was the only thing that felt possible. Then I said, "How long?" Neither of them answered immediately. Vivian looked at Christoph. Christoph looked at the floor. I said, I am asking a factual question. How long? 8 months, Christoph said. His voice was almost inaudible. I looked at Vivian. She was looking at her hands. She did not contradict the number. I said, does Clara know? Clara was our daughter. She was 32 years old, and she had been married to Christoph for 4 years, and she was at that specific moment in Brussels attending a Saturday conference for the Social Work Association she chaired. She had texted me that morning at 9:43 to say the first session was running long and she would be home for dinner. The text was still on my phone in my dressing gown pocket. Neither of them answered. I said, I will take that as a no. I turned and walked back toward the stairs. I heard Vivian say my name again, and I heard Christoph say something in a low, urgent voice that I did not try to hear. I went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the window I could see the canal. The canal in March is a specific shade of grey that the canal in other months is not a grey that is both flat and somehow deep, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for what turned out to be approximately 40 minutes. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened next, because who I am is relevant to what happened next in a way that matters for the story to make sense. My name is Georg Hamann. I am 64 years old. I was born in Liège, the second son of a Walloon schoolmaster and a Flemish accountant, whose marriage was a successful negotiation between two linguistic inheritances that produced in me a person who was comfortable in both French and Dutch, and who had therefore absorbed from childhood the understanding that the same situation looks different depending on the language you describe it in, and that the most accurate description requires the capacity to hold both simultaneously. I studied economics at the University of Liège and then commercial law at the Katholieke Universiteit Leuven, and after 4 years of working for a large auditing firm in Brussels, I founded my own consultancy in 1990 in the specific area that my combination of economics and legal training had equipped me to work in, which was corporate restructuring and business valuation. I built the firm over 34 years into a practice that employed 18 consultants and that had, over that period, worked on 347 transactions. I know the number because I counted them when I was sitting on the edge of the bed looking at the canal. Vivienne and I had met at a conference in Bruges in 1991, the year after I founded the firm. She was a financial journalist at a Brussels business publication, and she was covering the conference for a piece on corporate restructuring trends, and we had been placed at the same table for the conference dinner and had talked for 4 hours about things that were not the conference. She was beautiful in the specific way of women who are primarily interesting, and whose beauty is part of their interest rather than a separate quality. She was funny in the dark, dry way of people who have been paying close attention to human behavior for a long time and have developed some considered views about what they have seen. She was honest in the manner I found most useful, which is to say directly and without embellishment. I liked her immediately and completely, and the liking had never fully abated in 31 years of marriage, not even when the marriage had passed through the phases that long marriages pass through and had arrived in its most recent phase at something I would have described before that Sunday morning as settled contentment. The settled contentment I now understood had been more fully settled on my side than on hers. Christoph Marschall was 38 years old and an architect at a firm in Brussels that designed primarily residential projects, the kind of carefully proportioned houses and apartments in the Flemish countryside and Brussels suburbs that appeared in architecture magazines and that cost more than they looked like they should cost. He was tall and had dark hair going silver at the temples, and he had the specific social fluency of someone raised in a family where social performance was expected and practiced a quality that I had observed in the 4 years of his marriage to Clara and had assessed as charm without having examined it more carefully, which I now recognized as an error in my assessment methodology. He had been, as far as I had understood it, a good husband to our daughter and a respectful presence in our family. He came to Sunday dinners. He fixed things around the house when I asked him. He talked to me about architecture, and I talked to him about business valuations, and we had managed, in 4 years, to develop what had appeared to be a genuine, if not particularly deep, mutual regard. 8 months, while he was coming to Sunday dinners and fixing things in the house and having the architecture and business valuations conversations, he had been conducting a parallel relationship with my wife in the specific domestic spaces that constituted our shared life. I sat on the bed for 40 minutes. Then I got up and went to my study, which was on the same floor, and I closed that door too, and I sat at my desk and began to think with the professional precision that I had spent 34 years developing for the specific purpose of thinking through complicated situations clearly. What I understood by the end of that period of thinking was the following. My marriage was over. This was not a conclusion I needed to verify or deliberate about further. Whatever had existed between Vivian and me had been for at least 8 months a performance that I had been participating in from one side without knowing I was in a performance at all, which meant that the performance was not a marriage in any meaningful sense of the word. The marriage was over. That was the first conclusion. The second conclusion was that how I responded in the period immediately following the discovery would determine a very large number of things, including the financial structure of the divorce, the legal characterization of what had occurred, the custody arrangements for information and narrative, and the emotional trajectory of my daughter's life when she discovered what had been happening. These were not small matters, and they were not matters to be addressed in the emotional register of shock and grief, which was where the natural human response to betrayal would have placed me if I had allowed it to. I had spent 34 years in corporate restructuring. The essential skill of corporate restructuring is the management of complex situations in which multiple stakeholders have conflicting interests and in which the available assets must be allocated among competing claims according to principles that are both legally defensible and strategically sound. I was not going to allow the dissolution of my marriage to be managed at a lower standard of professional competence than I would have brought to a mid-sized commercial insolvency. This sounds cold. It was cold. Cold was what the situation required. The third conclusion was that I needed to know before I did anything else the current legal and financial position with complete accuracy. Not approximately. Exactly. I called my lawyer. His name was Michel de Wael, and he had been my commercial lawyer for 15 years and had handled various aspects of the firm's legal affairs throughout that period. He was 60 years old, conservative, and thorough. And he had the specific quality that I valued most in a lawyer, which was the quality of telling me things I did not want to hear, with the same composure he brought to telling me things I did want to hear, because the accurate information was what mattered regardless of its valence. I called him on his mobile phone on a Sunday morning, and he answered. I told him briefly and precisely what had happened and what I needed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Georg, before we discuss the legal position, I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." He said, "Are you certain about what you saw?" I said, "I am a person who has spent 34 years making professional assessments of complicated situations. I am certain." He said, "Good. Then I need to know several things." He asked me 7 questions. 7 specific questions about the current legal and financial structure of the marriage, the ownership arrangements of the house and the second property in the Ardennes, the shareholding structure of my firm, the investment accounts, the pension instruments, and the current state of a separation agreement that he confirmed. Vivienne had apparently already been in contact with a lawyer about the fact that a preliminary contact had been made to his office in January that he had not felt it appropriate to mention at the time. January. I absorbed this 2 months before the Sunday in March. 2 months before I found them in the kitchen, she had already been to a lawyer. I said, "What is the current exposure under Belgian marital property law if she files for divorce citing irreparable breakdown?" He told me, Under the matrimonial regime, we had established the default division of marital assets would apply to everything accumulated during the marriage, which in our case was substantial and included not only the properties and the investment accounts, but a portion of the equity in the firm that had been co-invested through a joint account during the early years of the firm's growth. He said, "Georg, what she is entitled to is not small." I said, "I know." I said, "I need you to prepare a comprehensive asset map of everything that is currently in a legally vulnerable position, and I need to know what structural modifications are available and in what time frame. I also need to know whether the circumstances of the betrayal affect the divorce proceedings in any way under Belgian law." He said, "The circumstances affect the fault determination, which has some bearing on certain aspects of the settlement, but Belgian divorce law has moved significantly in the no-fault direction in recent years, and fault is less determinative than it once was. However, there are ancillary matters that can be affected." He paused. "I want you to come into my office tomorrow morning. This is not a conversation for a Sunday phone call." I said Monday morning, 8 o'clock. I spent the rest of that Sunday in my study. I heard Vivian's footsteps on the stairs twice, and then on the floor outside the study, and then the footsteps going away again. I heard Christoph's car in the driveway at some point in the early afternoon. I did not go to the window to watch him leave. I ate nothing. I drank the coffee that had gone cold on the counter downstairs and that I had taken up to the study without remembering doing so. I worked. What I worked on was a preliminary financial map of our marital estate, a document I was capable of constructing accurately because the management of our household finances had been for 31 years primarily my responsibility. Vivienne had managed the journalism career and then the communications consultancy she had founded when she left journalism. And she had contributed significantly to the household income throughout the marriage, but the investment decisions and the structural financial planning had been mine, which meant I knew exactly where everything was and what it was worth and what legal category it fell into. By the time I stopped working at 11 o'clock that night, I had a 23-page document that contained every asset, its current value, its legal classification, and my preliminary assessment of its position in a divorce proceeding. I also had a list of 4 things I needed to do before Vivienne initiated the legal process that, based on the January lawyer contact, she was already planning. The days between Sunday and the following Saturday, when I had arranged to meet Michel in his office, had a specific quality that I have thought about often since. I continued my ordinary life. I went to the office each morning at my usual time. I had client meetings on Tuesday and Thursday that I conducted without any deviation from my normal professional register. I came home in the evenings and ate dinner at the kitchen table with Vivienne, who was attentive in the specific way of someone managing guilt through performance of consideration, bringing me coffee without being asked, and asking about my work with renewed interest. I recognized this pattern. I had seen it in the behavior of executives who had been caught in professional misconduct and who responded to the knowledge that they had been caught by performing their role with heightened diligence, as if the quality of the performance could retroactively amend the record. On Wednesday, I came home early from the office and found Christoph's car in the driveway. I parked on the street and sat in my car for a moment, assessing what I wanted to do. Then I drove away and parked in the square 2 blocks away and walked for an hour along the canal path. When I came back, the car was gone. I went inside. Vivienne was in the kitchen starting dinner. She looked up when I came in and I said I had parked on the street because I had boxes in the boot from the office and I did not want to block the driveway. She said that was fine. We had dinner. After dinner, I went to the study and noted the time his car had arrived and the time it had left in the small notebook I had started keeping on Monday. On Thursday, Vivienne suggested we have dinner with Clara and Christoph on Saturday. She said it so naturally with such complete composure that I understood something I had not fully understood before, which was that she was genuinely a good actor This was not a quality I had ever had reason to assess before. I said Saturday was fine. I called Clara that evening to confirm, and Clara, who knew nothing about any of this, and who heard only her father's ordinary voice on the phone, said she was looking forward to it and asked if she should bring dessert. Clara brought a chocolate cake from a patisserie in Ixelles. Christophe brought wine. We sat at the kitchen table, the four of us, and ate and talked, and I watched Christophe manage the situation across the table. He was very good at it, better than I had expected, which told me something about the duration and intensity of the practice he had been getting. He maintained normal eye contact with me, asked normal questions about the firm, laughed at the right moments. The only tell, which I doubt anyone else noticed, was a slight over-precision in the way he held his wine glass, the grip of someone who is managing their hands because they do not trust what the hands might do unsupervised. I noted it. I noted everything. Clara was happy. She was describing a family she was working with at the Social Work Association, a complicated situation involving a custody dispute and inadequate housing, speaking with the specific engaged energy that she brought to her work and that I had always recognized as her mother's quality of genuine interested attention applied to social rather than professional material. Vivienne listened and asked good questions. Christophe listened. I listened. The table had the warmth of a family that functions well, and looking at it from the outside, you would have seen exactly that and been entirely wrong about every dimension of it. After they left, and I was washing up, and Vivienne was drying, she said, "It was a nice evening." I said, "Yes." She said, "Clara seems well." I said, "She does." She put a plate away on the shelf where it always went, and I handed her the next one, and we moved through the rest of the washing up in the ordinary, companionable silence of 31 years of shared domestic routine. In the morning, I drove to Michelle's office. Monday at 8 o'clock, I was at Michelle's office. She arrived at 6:30, calling from the front door that the conference had been excellent and that she had brought cheese from a market in Ixelles. I came down from the study. Vivienne was in the kitchen. The three of us had dinner at the kitchen table that had been at the centre of our family for 23 years, eating the cheese and some pasta that Vivienne had made, and the conversation was normal in the sense that all three of us were performing normalcy, and two of us were performing it under enormous pressure for entirely different reasons. I performed it because I had decided that Clara's discovery of what had been happening to her marriage was not going to happen as collateral damage to my divorce proceedings. She was going to find out, and she was going to find out from me at the right time and in the right way. That was the one thing in the situation I was most determined to control. After dinner, Clara helped her mother clear the table and wash up, and then she said she was tired and was going to call Christophe and then go to bed. I said good night and kissed her on the cheek and watched her go up the stairs with the cheese she had brought from the market and her bag from the conference, and I stood in the hallway listening to the sound of her voice upstairs on the phone. The easy domestic sound of a woman talking to her husband at the end of the day, and I thought about what that sound was going to become when she knew what I knew, and I went back into the study and closed the door. Monday at 8 o'clock, I was at Michelle's office. He had been there since 7, the files already organized on his desk, his coffee made, his reading glasses on. He had prepared a document overnight that laid out the legal framework with the precision I had expected from him. We worked for 3 hours. I want to describe those 3 hours because they represent the aspect of this story that I find most difficult to account for without either defending myself too much or criticizing myself too much, and the balance between those two requires care. What we did in those 3 hours was legal work. It was work that Michelle was entirely qualified to perform and that I was entirely entitled to commission. And every action that resulted from it was, as Michelle confirmed at the time, and has confirmed since, legally sound, defensible, and appropriate to the circumstances. I want to be clear about this because the account of what I did can be made to sound calculating in a way that implies illegitimacy, and the calculating was not illegitimate. A person who discovers their spouse has been planning a divorce for at least 2 months, has been consulting a lawyer, and who has not informed them of this, is a person who has been placed in a structurally disadvantaged position through no fault of their own, and the correction of a structural disadvantage through legal instruments is not the same as unfairness. Having said that, I also want to be clear about what the correction was for, because I thought about this in the days following Monday, and because the honest account requires it. Michelle identified 4 available actions, and each of them had a primary justification and a secondary one. The primary justification for each was that it accurately reflected a legal reality, a thing that was genuinely true about the structure of the assets and that had simply not been formally documented. The secondary justification was that the documentation of that genuine legal reality changed the financial parameters of the divorce in a direction that was more favorable to me and less favorable to Vivian. I authorized all 4 actions. I authorized them because they were legally sound and because they reflected genuine realities. I also authorized them, I am honest enough to say, because I wanted the parameters to change and because my professional training had given me the capacity to identify and execute changes to them that many people in my position would not have known to make. At the end of 3 hours, I had a clear picture of the legal terrain and a set of 4 actions that Michelle advised were legitimate, defensible, and if executed correctly, would significantly alter the financial structure of the divorce in my favor before Vivian's lawyer had the opportunity to file the initial pleading that would freeze the assets in their current configuration. The 4 actions were as follows. The first was a revision to the partnership structure of the firm that moved a significant portion of my equity into a structure that was legally categorized differently from standard marital property, for technical reasons that I will not detail here, except to say that they were sound, and that Michelle had used the same structure in 2 previous cases. The second was a transfer of the Ardennes property into a separate trust arrangement that I had been considering for tax purposes for several years, and that happened to have the additional property of placing it outside the direct scope of the marital estate. The third was a documentation of financial transactions from the period of the affair that established a specific legal record relevant to the fault determination. The fourth I will address separately because it is the action that I find most difficult to describe, and that I think about most in the period since. The fourth action was to have a conversation with Christophe before I had any conversation with Vivienne. This required explanation. Michel had identified in his review of the financial records that Christophe had, during the period of the affair, received through an arrangement with Vivienne access to information about my firm's business that he had used in his professional practice. Specifically, 2 of the architectural projects Christophe had won commissions for in the preceding 8 months were projects in which the developers had previously been in conversation with my consultancy about potential restructuring work. Conversations that I had had with those developers in a professional context, and that contained information I had discussed at home at the kitchen table, in the normal course of talking about work with a spouse. Vivian had passed this information intentionally or through carelessness born of the intimacy of the affair to Christophe, who had used it to position his firm's approach to the developers in a way that had given his pitch an advantage it would not otherwise have had. This was potentially a very serious matter. Not potentially in the hedge fund sense of possibly or perhaps, potentially in the legal sense of the matter, had the potential to constitute misuse of confidential business information, which in Belgium had specific regulatory and civil implications. I had Michel prepare a memo on the legal dimensions of this. He delivered it on Tuesday. The memo was 17 pages. I read it twice, and then I put it in the folder with the other documents, and I thought about it for 2 days. I want to be honest with you about what I thought about during those 2 days. I thought about 2 things simultaneously. The first was the practical question of how the information in Michelle's memo affected the overall negotiating position in the divorce proceedings, and the answer to this was that it affected it significantly, because the existence of the potential claim gave me a lever that I had not had before, and that, if used correctly, would change the shape of what Vivian could reasonably expect to receive in a settlement. This was a professional analysis, and it was accurate. The second thing I thought about was my daughter. Clara had built 4 years of marriage on the foundation of a man who had, it turned out, been conducting an affair with her mother for 8 months of those 4 years. I was not going to be able to protect her from that knowledge. The knowledge was coming regardless of what I did. What I could potentially affect was the financial context in which it arrived, specifically whether Christoph would be in a position of financial security or financial vulnerability when Clara eventually learned what had happened and made the decisions she was going to need to make about her own life. I decided that financial vulnerability was more appropriate to the situation than financial security. This is not a pure or comfortable conclusion, and I am not presenting it as one. I am presenting it as the conclusion I reached. On Wednesday, I called Christoph. I asked him to meet me for coffee. He agreed, his voice carrying the quality of someone expecting a confrontation they have been dreading and are resolved to endure. I named a cafe near his office in Brussels. He arrived 5 minutes early, which told me something. He was already sitting at the table when I came in with a coffee he had ordered but not drunk, and with the specific posture of someone who has been rehearsing what they are going to say. I sat down across from him. I ordered a coffee. I let the silence sit for a moment. Because a moment of silence before a significant conversation is a professional tool I have used for 34 years, and that I see no reason to abandon in a personal context. He looked different than he looked at Saturday dinner. The dinner performance had required sustained management of his presentation, and he had maintained it well, but sitting across a cafe table from his wife's father, who had found him in that kitchen and had said nothing for a week, the performance apparatus had been dismantled. He looked tired. He looked as though he had been sleeping poorly, which was an entirely appropriate response to his situation. There was a quality of something else in his face that I was interested to identify. It was not contrition exactly. It was not fear, which would have been understandable. It was the specific expression of a man who is waiting to find out the dimensions of his mistake, who has understood that the mistake is significant, and who is in a state of suspended assessment, waiting for the full scope to be revealed. This told me that he was intelligent. Only an intelligent person waits in that specific way. A less intelligent person would have been either aggressive or capitulatory. He was neither. He was waiting. Then I said, I want to have a professional conversation before we have any personal ones. He looked at me with an expression that combined confusion and wariness. I said, I am going to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting until I have finished. I told him about the 2 architectural projects. I told him what I knew about the timing and the context. I told him what Michelle's memo said about the legal dimensions. I was precise and I was not loud, and I did not use language that was more charged than the facts required. I told him exactly what was true, and I told him what the available legal options were. He went very still during this. The coffee sat in front of him untouched. His face had the look of someone receiving information that is restructuring their understanding of their situation. When I finished, I waited. I had learned in client meetings that the moment after you deliver the significant information is the moment that tells you everything about the person you are dealing with. Whether they deny, deflect, bargain, or sit quietly with the facts and process them accurately. He sat quietly, he processed, and then he said, I did not know that she had told me things she should not have told me. His voice was measured. He was not defending himself. He was clarifying a specific factual point. He said, I knew she had mentioned the developers in conversation. I did not understand that the information was confidential in the professional sense. I said nothing, he said. I am not sure that distinction matters to you at this point, and I understand why it would not, but it is accurate. I said, it matters for the legal characterization of the matter. Yes, for my personal assessment of your conduct, I have a different framework, and the distinction matters rather less. He looked at me. He said, what do you want? I said, I want you to understand your position. That is what I want from this conversation. He said, and after this conversation? I said, after this conversation you are going to need to consult a lawyer. He said, are you going to file? I said, I have not decided. This was true, I had not decided. What I had decided was that the decision would be mine to make at the time of my choosing, and not his. I finished my coffee. I stood up. I said, Christoph, one more thing. Whatever legal proceedings happen in the next months, Clara will find out what has been happening. You know this. I know this. What I want you to think about between now and then is how you are going to conduct yourself when she does. I am not going to tell you what to do. I am going to tell you that the manner in which you handle that conversation will matter to her for the rest of her life, and I would like you to have the decency to handle it with the honesty and directness it deserves. He looked at the table. He said, I know. I said, I hope so. I looked at him for a moment. He was 38 years old, and he had made choices that had destroyed 2 relationships simultaneously, and that had, through a chain of consequences he apparently had not fully thought through when he was making them, created a legal vulnerability he had not anticipated. He was not a villain. He was a person who had done something that was both selfish and careless, and that had caused damage that was going to take years to absorb. I did not feel sympathy for him. I also did not feel the particular satisfaction that I had seen in other people's accounts of confronting those who had wronged them. What I felt was the flat and precise feeling of someone who has completed a necessary task. And I left. Vivienne came to me that same evening. She had been, for the 4 days since the Sunday kitchen discovery, living in the house with the specific quality of someone waiting for a shoe to drop that they have placed themselves. She came to my study door and knocked. I said, come in. She sat down in the chair across from my desk. The chair where clients sat during my early years of practice when I had worked from home, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has reached the end of their capacity to carry it. She said, Georg, we need to do this properly. I said, I agree. She said, I have a lawyer. She mentioned the name. I recognized it. Good firm. She said, she has advised me that under the current matrimonial regime, the joint assessment of the estate should begin with a complete inventory. I said, I have already prepared an inventory. She looked at me with a slight adjustment of expression, the adjustment of someone recalibrating an assumption. She had assumed, I think, that I had spent the previous 4 days in the emotional register of a betrayed husband, which would have placed me in the reactive and disorganized position. She was recalibrating toward a different assessment. I watched her recalibrate, and I thought about the 31 years and the specific quality of intelligence that had attracted me to her at the conference dinner in Bruges in 1991, the intelligence that was quick and lateral, and that processed situations with the speed of a person who had spent years as a journalist asking the question behind the question. She was using that intelligence now. She was looking at the prepared inventory and the steady voice and the fact that I had been in the house for 5 days without falling apart, and she was reading it correctly. She said, how long have you been planning? I said, since Sunday evening. She said, you prepared a 23-page financial inventory in 1 evening. I said, it is what I do. She looked at me. She said, Georg. I said, Vivian. She said, I owe you more than a conversation in your study. She said, I know that. I said, yes. She said, I do not know how to give you what I owe you. I said, I am not asking for it. I said, what I am asking for is that we proceed with clarity and without pretending that the situation is other than what it is. She said, what is the situation in your assessment? I said, the marriage is over. The separation will involve complex asset arrangements. There is a matter related to the professional conduct of your relationship with Christoph that complicates the proceedings in a specific way. My lawyer will share the details with yours. Beyond those legal facts, there is the question of how we conduct ourselves toward each other and toward our daughter. And that question is one I want to handle with as much dignity as the circumstances permit. She was quiet for a long time. The house was quiet around us. Outside the window, the canal was doing what it did at 10 o'clock in the evening in March, which is to be a black surface, reflecting the streetlights in a way that looks like something from a painting that tries to express an emotion without naming it. She said, "You are not going to tell me what you feel." I said, "Not tonight." She said, "When?" I said, "When I know." She said, "Georg." She said it in the tone she had used to say my name on the conference dinner night in Bruges, the tone of a person who is fully present to another person, and I had to hold myself very carefully in place while hearing it, because that tone was the exact distance between what we had been and what we now were, and the distance was very large. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I am managing." She said, "That is the saddest thing you have ever said to me." I said, "I know." I said, "Vivian, I am not going to make this unnecessarily difficult. I intend to proceed professionally, and I expect the same in return. There are some structural matters that my lawyer has already addressed in accordance with arrangements that have been in discussion for some time and that are legally sound. The inventory I have prepared reflects the current position. I will share it with your lawyer." He said, "Good." I said, "There is one other matter I need to raise with you." She looked at me. I told her about the professional information, not accusatorially, factually. She listened. When I finished, she said I did not think of it that way. I said, "I know you did not. That does not change the legal characterization." She was quiet. Then she said, "What does this mean for the proceedings?" I said, "It means they are more complicated. It means the range of outcomes is wider than it might otherwise have been." I said, "Vivian, I am not trying to punish you. I am trying to establish a settlement that is fair, given the complete facts of the situation." She nodded. She looked older in that moment than she had looked on Sunday morning. Or perhaps she looked exactly as old as she was, and I was seeing it clearly for the first time. She said, "There is something I need to tell you." I waited. She said, "I am going to end the relationship with Christoph. I ended it on Monday." She said this in the flat tone of someone reporting a fact they have made peace with. She said, "I am not telling you this because I want anything from you as a result. I am telling you because I think you should know and because I owe you the honesty of it." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Georg, I am sorry. Not for the marriage ending, because I think the marriage has been over for longer than either of us wanted to admit. I am sorry for how I did it. I am sorry for what it is going to mean for Clara. I am sorry for the specific form of the betrayal." She said this last part, looking directly at me, and I believed her. It did not change the other conclusions, but I believed the specific thing she was saying. The divorce proceedings took 9 months. This is neither fast nor slow for a contested divorce in Belgium with complex asset arrangements, and it was managed on both sides with the professional conduct that both our lawyers and both of us were capable of. There were 2 difficult periods. The first was in June, when Clara found out. I had told her 2 weeks after the Sunday discovery in the manner I had planned. I drove to Brussels to the apartment she had been staying in since Christoph had moved out of their home in May, having had the conversation with her that he had apparently had with honesty and directness. Clara had been at the time I told her about the additional dimension, already in the raw middle of the end of her marriage, and learning that the woman who had destroyed it was her mother was a specific kind of layered grief that I do not have adequate words for, and that I watched her carry with the particular helpless grief of a parent who cannot take the pain from their child. I want to describe that afternoon in Brussels, because it is the afternoon I think about most when I think about the period following the Sunday in March. Clara's apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building on a narrow street in the Ixelles district. an apartment she had found quickly after leaving the house she had shared with Christoph, and that had the functional quality of a space assembled rapidly from what was immediately available rather than chosen. There were boxes still half unpacked in the corner of the living room. The furniture was a combination of pieces she had brought from the house and pieces borrowed from friends. On the kitchen counter there was a fruit bowl that I recognized as one she had taken from our house when she left for university at 18, and that had appeared on every counter she had had since. The sight of it made me feel something I was not expecting to feel. She made tea. She had her mother's habit of making tea as a response to significant moments, which was the kind of observation that arrived with a particular edge in the current context. I sat on the borrowed sofa and I held the tea, and I told her. I told her in the sequence that seemed most honest, which was the chronological sequence. The Sunday in March, the 40 minutes on the bed, the call to Michelle, the week of appearing normal, the conversation with Christoph, the meeting with Vivienne, the legal proceedings. I told her about the professional information and what had been done with it. I told her about the settlement. I told her the specific number, so that she had the full picture. She listened to all of it. She asked no questions during the telling. She held her teacup and she looked at the middle distance, and she listened with the complete professional attention she brought to difficult information in her work. And underneath the professional attention, I could see what was costing her the most effort, which was the maintenance of that attention itself. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Papa." She had called me Papa since she was 4 years old. Not Dad, not Father Papa. She said it now in the tone she used when she was accessing something older and more fundamental between us, the tone of a person going back to the root of a relationship when the branches have been damaged. She said, "How did you know?" I said, "I found them in the kitchen." She looked at me. She said, "I mean, how did you know to do all of it? The way you did it, the lawyer, the structures, the documentation. How did you know to do it in that order and not some other way?" I said, "It is what I do professionally." I said, "When things have to be restructured, I know the sequence." She said, "And you did it like that, for me." I said, "Partly for me also." I said, "I am not going to pretend it was entirely altruistic." She smiled at this, very slightly the smile of someone who appreciates honesty when it would have been easier and perhaps more flattering to omit the qualifying detail. She said, "I know. But the part that was for me, that you did not file the professional matter, that you waited until the settlement was structured before you told me, that was for me." I said, "Yes." She put her teacup down. She looked at her hands. She said, "I have been trying to understand what I feel about her, about maman." She used the French for mother, not the Flemish, which was her way when she was talking about something emotional. She said, "The social work training is not particularly useful here because I know all the frameworks for understanding why people do self-destructive things and why betrayal happens in long marriages and what the psychological architecture of it looks like. The knowledge does not make the feeling any less." I said, "No, it does not." She said, "Are you angry?" I said I was angry on the Sunday. Since then it has been something else. She said, "What?" I said, "I am not certain. Something more like grief than anger. Grief for the marriage that turned out to have a different history than I thought it had." She said, "Do you think you would have stayed if you had not found out?" I thought about this carefully. I said, "I do not know," I said. "I think the marriage was in the condition it was in, regardless of whether I knew the specific cause of it. And the specific cause may have been a symptom of the condition rather than the origin of it." She said, "That is a very careful way of saying something." I said, "It is the most accurate way I can find." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I was working with a family last month, a mother who had done something her children could not forgive her for, and I was helping the family find a way forward, and I was thinking professionally about it and being professionally useful, and I was also underneath the professional thing, thinking about whether I was ever going to be able to forgive my own mother." She said, "I wanted you to know that." I said, "I know." She said, "I am not there yet." I said, "I know that too." I told her everything. I did not soften it or manage it beyond the selection of the right moment and the right setting. She had been a social worker for 8 years, and she had a professional capacity for receiving difficult information that I respected and that she brought to bear on this information not easily and not without breaks in the composure, but with the fundamental quality of a person who does not avoid what is true. She said at the end of the conversation, sitting in the small apartment with the cup of tea she had not drunk, "Papa, how long did you know before you told me?" I said, 2 weeks. She said, "Why did you wait 2 weeks?" I said, "Because I needed those 2 weeks to ensure that the legal position was structured in a way that would give you the maximum available protection." She looked at me. She said, "You were protecting me." I said I was doing what I could. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wish you had told me sooner. I thought about this." I said, "I know." She said, "I understand why you waited." I said, "I did not know how to tell you the day I found out. I could not have done it correctly that day." She said, "I know." She said, "Were you all right?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you now?" I said, "Better." She said, "Me too, better." She held her teacup in both hands, and she looked at the window that overlooked the small interior garden of her building, the garden that had a single old lime tree that was just coming into leaf in the May morning. She said, "I am going to be angry at her for a long time." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you?" I thought about it. I said, "I do not think anger is exactly what I feel." She said, "What do you feel?" I said, "I am not certain yet." I said, "I will tell you when I know." The second difficult period was at the signing of the final settlement. The documents were ready in September. Michel and Vivienne's lawyer, a woman named Maître Fontaine, who had been rigorous and fair throughout, had reached an agreement that was the result of many months of detailed negotiation, and that reflected the full complexity of the financial picture as it had emerged, including the professional information matter which had been addressed through a separate agreement with Christophe's participation that I had not needed to formalize into legal proceedings because the existence of the option had been sufficient. We met at Maître Fontaine's office in Brussels to sign. Vivienne was already seated when I arrived. She looked well, which was not the right word, but it was the available word. She looked as though she had come to some accommodation with the situation that had given her a kind of steadiness that I had not seen in her since March. We did not speak much before the signing began. The lawyers handled the procedural elements. There was a document, there was a table, there were pens. There was in the margin of the settlement agreement at the section dealing with asset allocation a number that represented what Vivienne would receive from the marital estate. The number was significantly lower than what she would have received if the proceedings had been structured around the default position. I signed my name on the relevant pages in my customary signature, which has not changed in 34 years. Vivienne signed on her pages. Maître Fontaine signed as witness. Michel signed as witness. The copies were collated. It was done. In the minutes after the signing, while the lawyers were organizing the documents, Vivienne and I sat at the conference table without speaking. I looked at the window of the conference room, which faced a courtyard with a stone wall covered in the particular Belgian moss that grows on north-facing stone surfaces, and that has a colour I have always found specific to this country. A dark, saturated green that looks black from a distance and reveals itself only when you are close. I looked at the moss. I thought about the 31 years. I thought about the conference dinner in Bruges in 1991 and the 4 hours of conversation and the understanding that I had met someone I was going to know for a very long time. I had been correct about that. As we were preparing to leave, Vivienne said, "Georg." I looked at her. She said, "I know what you did." She said it without accusation, simply as a factual statement. She said, "I know the structures were not all in discussion before March." I said nothing. She said, "I am not contesting them. I want you to know that. I have accepted them." She said, "I wanted you to know that I understand the shape of what happened between the legal structures and the professional information. I understand it. I said, Vivian. She looked at me. I said, I did not do it to punish you. She said, I know. She said, you did it to protect Clara. I said, yes. She looked at me for a moment and said, that is something at least, and she left. What she had said was accurate. It was not entirely accurate. I had also done it for myself for the 31 years, for the Sunday in March, and the kitchen and the coffee cup I had put carefully on the counter in the exact spot I always put it. But it was more accurate than not accurate, and it was enough. I did not need it to be entirely accurate. I needed it to be close enough to true that I could carry it without it becoming a falsehood I was maintaining, and it was close enough. The firm continues. I had considered in the months of the divorce proceedings whether I wanted to continue running it, and I had concluded that I did, partly because the work was genuinely interesting and partly because I was 64 years old and did not know what I would do with unstructured time, and partly because the consultancy was in a very real sense the primary project of my adult life, and I was not prepared to abandon it. I have restructured the partnership, slightly brought in 2 younger partners who have expanded the firm's capacity in areas I had not been covering adequately, and I have reduced my own billable hours to a level that allows me to be more selective about the work I take. I want to tell you about a specific evening in October, 6 months after the settlement was signed, because it is the evening when I understood something that I had been moving toward understanding for most of the previous 7 months. I was at the office later than usual, working on a valuation analysis for a pharmaceutical distribution company that was being restructured out of a family dispute. The family dispute involved a father and 2 adult children who had different assessments of what the business was worth and different ideas about what should happen to it, and I had been hired by the neutral party, the bank that held the commercial debt, to provide an independent valuation that both sides could use as a reference point for their negotiations. It was good work. It was the kind of work I was good at, and that required the specific combination of financial analysis and interpersonal precision that I had spent 34 years developing. I was sitting at my desk at 7 in the evening with the analysis nearly complete, and I was looking at the numbers and the structure, and I was thinking about the family. I was advising the father and the 2 children, and the specific quality of disagreement that arises in family business disputes, which is always more about the relationship than about the business. And I was thinking about this in the professional analytical register, and then I stopped thinking in the professional register, and I thought about it personally, and I understood something. I had spent the previous 7 months processing what had happened to my marriage through the same framework I used to process corporate restructuring. This had been useful. It had produced good outcomes in terms of the financial settlement and the protection of my daughter's interests and the efficient management of an extremely complex situation. It had also, I now understood, been the only framework available to me, not because I had chosen it as the best tool for the job, but because it was the only tool I possessed with sufficient precision to handle the situation in real time. I had managed my own devastation the way I managed other people's complicated problems because that was what I knew how to do. This was not a criticism of myself, it was an observation. The observation had a further dimension, which was this: the professional framework had contained something that the purely emotional response would not have contained, which was the capacity to act in the interests of my daughter at a moment when the emotional version of myself would have been consumed by his own grief and would have had less to give her. The coldness had produced warmth. The precision had protected the person I loved most. These 2 things were not contradictory. They were the same thing expressed in different registers. I sat at the desk in October, and I held this understanding for a moment, and then I returned to the pharmaceutical valuation, because the pharmaceutical valuation was due the following morning, and there was work to do. I live in the house on the canal. Vivienne is in the apartment she moved to in April, near the European Quarter in Brussels, which suits her work. We do not speak often. When we do speak, it is about Clara, whom we both love without ambiguity, and who has become, in the year since the discovery, someone I know more closely and more honestly than I did before. Because the difficulty has stripped away the intermediate register and left only the real one. I have been having dinner with Clara on Sundays, not every Sunday, but many of them alternating between Liège and Brussels. We cook together, which is something we did not do when she was a child, because the kitchen then was Vivienne's domain, and I was a competent but uninspired participant in it. It turns out that Clara is an excellent cook, and that she had been wanting to teach me things for years, and had not had the occasion to do so. I have learned in the past 6 months to make a proper water zouille and a correct carbonade and a rabbit braised in Belgian ale that Clara says would embarrass a Flemish grandmother, which is apparently the highest available standard. We talk during these Sundays in the way I had hoped we would be able to talk when she was small, and that the normal configuration of her growing up and going away and making her own life had naturally prevented. We talk about her work and my work and what is happening in Belgium and what is happening in the world, and we talk about her mother sometimes when the subject arrives naturally, and about Christophe when the subject arrives. We do not force any of it. The conversations go where they go. She said to me one Sunday in January, 3 months after the settlement, while we were eating the rabbit, she had taught me to make Papa, I need to ask you something. I said, ask. She said, are you lonely? I thought about it. I said, sometimes. She said, is it bad? I said, no. I said, there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. She said, yes, I know that distinction. She said, I just wanted to know if it was all right. I said, it is all right. She said, good. Then she passed me the bread. Clara is rebuilding. She has the specific quality of a person who has been damaged by something real and who is working through it rather than around it, which is the slower path and the better one. She and Christophe finalized their divorce in August. Christophe has moved to a smaller practice as far as I know, and has reduced his professional profile significantly from where it was a year ago. I have not sought information about this and have not received it. I did not file the legal matter relating to the professional information. The existence of the option was sufficient for the purpose it served, and the filing would have caused Clara additional collateral exposure that she did not deserve. I walked to the canal this morning. It is March again, exactly 1 year after the Sunday in the kitchen, and the canal is the same flat white it was then, the light that promises warmth it does not have. I stood on the path beside the water for 20 minutes before coming back to the office. I was thinking about the 31 years and what is true about them. Because I have been in a process of revising my understanding of those years in the light of what I now know, and the revision is not complete. The revision requires a specific quality of honesty that I find even after a year of practice still difficult to maintain consistently. The easiest version is the one in which the 31 years were a deception, in which Vivienne was always performing rather than feeling, in which what I experienced as a marriage was a construct that I believed in while she was elsewhere emotionally, in the real places where real things happen for her. This version is not accurate. I know it is not accurate because I know what a sustained performance looks like from the outside, and what I saw in those 31 years was not a sustained performance. It was a real marriage that became less real over time through processes that were probably operating in both of us without our naming them. And that reached a point where the gap between what it was and what both of us had needed from it was large enough for someone to walk into. I was part of that process. I find this both obvious and difficult to hold. The specific contribution I made to the condition of the marriage at the time the affair began is not the same as responsibility for the affair. The affair's was Vivienne's choice and Christophe's choice, and the specific form of the betrayal was their specific failure. But the marriage they destroyed was not in perfect repair before they destroyed it, and I was one of the 2 people responsible for its repair, and I had not been attending to the repair adequately. Both things are true. I have told this to Michelle, who said I was being unusually hard on myself for a man who had been treated badly. I have told it to Clara, who said that it was the right thing to understand, but that it should not prevent me from also understanding what had been done to me. I think both of them are correct. What I also know is that the end was the beginning of something that I do not yet have a name for. Not a new life exactly, because that phrase implies a repudiation of the old one that I do not feel. More like the continuation of my life under new conditions that I would not have chosen, but that have produced some things I would not have found under the old conditions, including the relationship I now have with my daughter, which is the best thing to have come from the worst period of my life. I am 64 years old, and I am a corporate restructuring consultant in Liège. And I watched my world change on a Sunday in March, and I managed the change with the professional precision I have spent 34 years developing. And I am still here, still working, still walking the canal path in the morning, still learning what the revision means. I want to tell you one more thing, the last thing. 3 weeks ago, I was walking the canal path in the early morning, as I do, and I passed a couple walking their dog in the opposite direction. A man and a woman of approximately my age. And the woman was laughing at something the man had said, and the man was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who has made the person beside them laugh and is pleased about this in the way of someone who has been trying to make them laugh for a long time. I noticed this as I notice things. I noticed it, and I kept walking, and a few steps later I felt something that I had not expected to feel, which was something like possibility. Not a large thing, a small thing. The small version of possibility that is available when the large version has been foreclosed. I walked the rest of the canal path with this small version in my chest, and when I got to the office I made my coffee, and I thought about it briefly, and then I started work, because there was work to do, and because work was what I had. The small possibility was also what I had, and the two together were for that morning enough. That is the whole of it. That is everything. One more thing. A week ago, Clara called me on a Thursday evening to tell me about a family she had been working with, a very difficult case involving multiple forms of harm and a set of outcomes that had required unusual persistence from her and her team to reach. She described it in the detail that she uses when she is proud of something. The specific detail of a person reporting on a thing they have done well. At the end she said, "I think it went the right way." I said, "It sounds like it did." She said, "I learned something from you about how to stay very precise when something is very difficult." She said, "I used to think that was a way of not feeling things." I said, "And now," she said, "now I think it is sometimes the only way to feel them properly, without being destroyed by them." I said, "Yes, that is what it is." The settlement number was not 70%. The final figure reflected the complete picture. Fair is not always equal. In this case, it was not equal. It was fair. I built 34 years of practice on the understanding that the first number is never the final number, that the space between the opening position and the settled one belongs to whoever is better prepared to occupy it. I was better prepared. I am still here. The canal is outside and the work is on the desk, and my daughter is coming for dinner on Sunday. That is enough. That will always be enough. The 70% was what they thought they would get. The actual number was something else entirely. I learned this at 22 years old, studying economics in Liège, and I have not forgotten it in 42 years, and I will not forget it now.